Thank you very much for the introduction, and good morning from Vienna. In today's talk, which is presented by me and my colleague Christoph Schwall, I will talk about ghost children, fluid identities of children in prehistoric Anatolia. When Christoph and I started developing this paper, we were intrigued by a wide occurrence of infant burials within settlements during the Chalcolithic and the early Bronze Age periods in Western Anatolia. A sharp distinction in burial locations between adults and infants, however, was not common during the Neolithic. But if Çatalhöyük was, according to Ian Hodder, and I quote, as much a cemetery as a settlement, the end of quote, why were the later Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age sites, such as Troy and Çukuriçi, as much primarily settlements, but exceptionally places for the position of infants? We will address this question by considering that an osteological child is not necessarily a person, and complement the passing archaeological evidence with a social-cultural anthropological interpretation. First, we will provide an overview of diversity of Neolithic mortuary practices. First, we will provide the diversity of Neolithic and early Chalcolithic mortuary practices and proceed with common mortuary practices during the late Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age periods in Western Anatolia. Based on two infant burials from Çukuriçi and regional comparison, we will show that infants were commonly buried within settlements. Lastly, we will introduce concept of delayed personhood and ghost children that would help us explain the puzzling evidence. For our convenience, we will use the term infant for individuals younger than 24 months and child for those aged between 2 and 12 years of age. Before we proceed, I would like to announce that human remains and photographs of deceased children will be shown in this presentation. Neolithic, as a new mode of life, promoted a broad range of mortuary practices, indicating little intra-group distinction in terms of age and gender in different regions of Anatolia, as recently pointed out by Clemens Lichter. We address differences and similarities between Neolithic and early Chalcolithic mortuary practices in Anatolia based on two parameters: location and the age of individuals buried, which allowed us to distinguish between three internally heterogeneous groups of ways of treating the dead from the bird's eye perspective. Based on these parameters, the first group of burials can be evident from trigonal skull buildings, Nevalitory skull cuts, and more than 800 intramural burials within houses at Çatalhöyük that are only a few examples of rich and diverse Neolithic mortuary practices within or between houses in southeastern and central Anatolia. At these sites and elsewhere, the Neolithic adults, children, and infants were buried within houses below the house floors in pits without any strict distinction based on gender or age of individuals. In these cases, spaces for the living and the dead overlapped. While the living inhabited the house floors from the above, the dead inhabited them from below, as you can see illustrated on the slide. The second group of Neolithic practices is evident at sites such as Ilpinay, Menteşe, and Höyük, where burials of adult individuals were attested on the edges of settlements, whereas infants were either buried between or within houses as depicted. A tendency for moving the dead adults towards the fringes of the settlements can therefore be already documented during the late Neolithic period. Within this group of mortuary practice, you can see a distinction between adult and infant burials, in which only infants were buried close to or within houses. The third group of burials can be evident from Akışkan. During the late Neolithic period, the dead adults and children of Akışkan Sea were buried in pits beneath the floor of huts, which fits our first group of burial practices. During the subsequent early Chalcolithic period, the settlement area then shifted to Akışkan B, located 100 meters to the south of the Akışkan C settlement. That adults and children from the early Akışkan B settlement were now buried in a communal burial ground on top of the abandoned late Neolithic site of Akışkan C. The clear separation between the spaces for the living and spaces for the dead now complements the three groups of mortuary practices during the Neolithic and early Bronze Chalcolithic in Anatolia. In later periods, spatial division between settlement and burial grounds seemingly became a norm in Western Anatolia. Unlike at Akışkan, where that infants, children, and adults and adults were buried together in burial ground, the burial ground appears more often than not reserved for the adults and older children during the late Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age periods in Western Anatolia. Within burial grounds that were deposited in pits, stone cists, and pitoid graves, a diversity that can be best observed from the early Bronze Age bucklet apron. Before our study, age was already identified as a crucial determinant for infant burial location. A systematic study conducted by Michele Massa at the cemetery of the Çocukları Höyük showed that infants and children were below 1 and 11 years of age were commonly buried in small jars within the communal cemetery. In contrast, infants below 1 year of age were placed underneath house floors or within the settlement without any grave goods. This norm can also be attested at Çukuriçi. The question of why infants were buried within or close to houses remains marginally addressed. Based on the infant burials from Çukuriçi, other regional sites, and cross-cultural research, we will show that the age cannot be considered as the only determinant of burial location. Therefore, the need for complementary interpretation. Today, the multi-period site of Çukuriçi Höyük is located in the central Western Anatolian coastline in the southern vicinity of the ancient city of Ephesus. Based on the reconstruction of the prehistoric coastline, Çukuriçi Höyük can be defined as a coastal site in prehistoric times. The mound consists of 8.5 meters of occupational layers, dating from the 7th to the beginning of the BC, meaning from the early Neolithic to the early Bronze Age period. During the excavations, 2 infant burials were excavated. The first one dating to the Late Chalcolithic period, and the second one was excavated from the early Bronze Age house context. The intramural Late Chalcolithic stone cist burial of an approximately 12 months old infant was excavated close to the nowadays artificially created northern border of the settlement mound. Although the northern and eastern stone slabs of the cist were not preserved, the burial was found intact. The pit of the grave was dug into the above situated Late Chalcolithic occupation level, although no nearby architectural remains were found. Inside the pit, the body of the infant was placed on a layer of sandy clay. The skeleton was east-west oriented and lying on the right side in a slightly contracted flex position with a face to the north, without grave goods, and the burial was radiocarbon dated between 3400 and 3300 Cal BC. The intramural early Bronze Age I burial at Çukuriçi was excavated inside a room of the settlement phase Çukuriçi Höyük 4. The burial was situated on the southwestern corner next to the wall underneath a floor level. The infant was buried in a tripod cooking pot with burn marks from the outside and with a ring diameter of 30 centimeters. The vessel represents a typical early Bronze Age shape of the settlement phase Çukuriçi Höyük 4 to 3. In this case, the vessel lost its primary function and was secondarily used as a burial container. The remains of the early Bronze Age I infant were found inside a container, placed on top of not further determinable organic material. The infant was placed on its right side in the southeastern northwestern direction with a strongly contracted flex position and the face to the north. The burial can be dated within the time frame between 2950 to 2850 Cal BC. The 2 well-dated burials from Çukuriçi fit the prevailing tradition of burying infants in the intramural context in Western Anatolia during the Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age period. Although there are different construction techniques of infant burials, namely in a stone steel slab and a cooking pot, burying infants close to or within houses is not unusual in the Aegean and Western Anatolia during these times. The general assumption that infants were buried intramurally, whereas adults were buried extramurally, in communal burial grounds during prehistoric times was already observed by Kurt Bittel in his work Prehistorische Forschungen in Kleinasien, published in 1934. On this map, we can better see a widely attested intramural infant burials in coastal and hinterland Western Anatolia during the Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age periods. By zooming into a few of these dots marking intramural infant burials, let us now provide a few examples from the Chalcolithic period. Infant and child burials have been attested at Pelga, close to modern-day Antalya, dating to the middle and late 5th millennium BC. At Pelga, 4 infants and children buried in pots between 1 and 4.5 years of age were found within well-preserved architectural features, indicating that this mortuary treatment can be attested in the Middle Chalcolithic and early Late Chalcolithic period. Also at Late Chalcolithic site of Bakla, dating to the second half of the 4th millennium BC, jars containing infant burials below 6 months of age were deposited below house floors. An intramural deposition of infants was also excavated at Late Chalcolithic by Sultan, dating to the second quarter of the 4th millennium BC. The pot contains an infant burial, which was uncovered outside of a house. Leading to the early Bronze Age, a few further examples of intramural burials, complementing the evidence from Çukuriçi Höyük, can be evident from Temi 1 on Lesbos, Becce Sultan, and Troy. At Temi, a jar covered with stone plates was placed inside the building, containing an approximately 7-month-old fetus. Another early Bronze Age 1 burial from Temi was found within a cooking pot. This burial contained a 2 to 3 months old infant that was placed inside a building. At Becce Sultan, 3 infant burials were excavated close to or within houses. Pots with buried infants were placed inside and close to the buildings, as indicated on the plan. Also at Troy 1, dating to the beginning of the 3rd millennium BC, 6 infant burials were found close to and within house 102. 2 infant burials were buried below the floor of the house, and 4 more burials were found outside of the northern wall. As reported by Bliegen and colleagues, they were all, and I quote, newborn babies, or at most not more than 2 or 3 weeks old, the end of quote. From these examples, it is apparent that during the Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age in Western Anatolia, burial grounds were primarily reserved for dead adults and older children, whereas settlements were reserved for the living and deceased infants under 1 year of age. But how was this evidence previously interpreted? And what can we say about the separation between adult and infant burials in these archaeological contexts from socio-cultural anthropological perspectives? In addressing this question, we follow the child-centered approach that takes into the consideration translation of the life course of individuals, and is initially pointed by Rosemary Joyce, and the fact that, and I quote, children are the key to understanding the links between the past and the future, the end of quote, as recently pointed out by Lillehammer. In the first step of our interpretation, we followed Carl's cross-cultural study that defined 4 most influential determinants for the position of the dead, which are the following: beliefs about the soul's nature, beliefs about the universal orders, beliefs of the nature of the afterlife, and age. As it can be seen from this study, mortuary practices are shaped by both shared communal beliefs and the age of the individuals. Now, considering that the age has already been determined for the deposition of infants below 1 year of age during Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age in Western Anatolia, what can we say about seeming these shared beliefs that could complement our understanding on infant mortuary practices within houses? For addressing the beliefs associated with infant mortuary treatment, we have first consulted the socio-cultural anthropological literature of how children come into being. Based on a qualitative cross-cultural study, Maurice Godelier showed that, and I quote, nowhere in any society do a man and a woman alone to suffice to make a child. What they make together is a fetus, but never a complete, viable human child, which is depicted here as in a first stage of making a human. Godelier continues that for making a human child, and I quote, others agents are needed who are more powerful than humans, who add what is lacking for the fetus to become a child. What is lacking is what customarily we call a soul, a spirit, in short, a usually invisible component, but one which is not necessarily immaterial, the end of quote, which is represented here in the second stage. But after that, cross-culturally, and I quote, the soul can reappear in the form of a ghost, which has a material, visible form, but is usually intangible, the end of quote, as depicted here in the third stage. This implies that also mortuary deposition is dependent on beliefs of conception. Considering that humans and spirits are involved in both conception and the position of children, let us now briefly provide an ethnographic example that could help us understand the mortuary record of children buried within settlements at the Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age in Western Anatolia. Among the Akan, an ethnic group residing in eastern and southwestern part of modern-day Ghana and Ivory Coast, the birth of a child was also associated with the ancestral spirits. However, birth did not grant personhood or membership to the community. Only after a naming ceremony that took place on the 8th day after birth, a child became a human among the Akan. Between birth and the naming period, the child was considered a ghost child who must have received all possible help from the terrestrial spirits and the abosom, meaning gods, to survive and stay on the earth. If a child died before the completion of the naming rites, the child returned to the land of spirits and was denied a complete burial that was reserved for adults. A child would be beaten, its body placed in a pot with sharp cutting elephant grass and buried near a woman's latrine or in the village midden heath. As Robert Ratray, who studied the Akan at the beginning of the 20th century, understood that not only infants, but also children before puberty were considered to be ghost children and treated in the same way after that. Therefore, Ratray ordered an Ashanti man to dig one of the kitchen middens, which is depicted in the figure on the left. He dug out several skeletons of infants in pots and bones of children. Ratray submitted a few of these bones for examination, which belonged to two individuals, an infant and a child approximately 5 years old, confirming that also older children could be buried in the same way. Following this short example, we can now return to the discussion of ancient beliefs that determine location of burials and move to our conclusions. What determined the deposition of ghost children among the Akan was what Lancy addressed as delayed personhood that could be translated into differentiated mortuary treatment on infants in comparison to adults. As Lancy showed, burial rites and mourning may be minimal or actively discouraged by the local community in the case of an infant or a child that died below 5 or 10 years of age. If the signature of delayed personhood is a private, small-scale or incomplete burial, as shown by Lancy, this practice can be well translated to the archaeological record of infant burials at Çukuriçi Höyük and other archaeological cases during the Chalcolithic and the early Bronze Age in Western Anatolia. In the latter case, it appears that delayed personhood was limited at least to 1 year of age, although it might be fluid. Only after that, only older children could be buried within communal burial grounds, whereas children below 1 year of age were almost exclusively buried within settlements, close to houses in jar, stone cists, and pits. When we started to think about the role of intramural infant burials at Çukuriçi, our first assumption was that it was a mother or household who deposited the child. If we follow this interpretation, then the intramural deposition of infants at Çukuriçi was exclusively mothers and households concerned. Considering the ethnographic evidence, however, child death matters to the community as a whole, and therefore, location of infant burials depends not only on the age, but also the local beliefs. To bury an infant, it may have been mother's or household choice, but also well-established communal practice of how to deal with potentially dangerous spirits that appear on earth in human bodies, but do not become human. The position of ghost children in intramural context was an established practice through which a community distinguished between us, humans, and them, spirits, not fully human yet. With this conclusion, we can now complement the detailed studies that have previously identified age as the main determinant of infant burial location. Acknowledging that it's not only age, but also communal beliefs that determine the location of burial, then a shared belief in delayed personhood could now be inferred from intramural infant burial practices during the Chalcolithic and the early Bronze Age periods in Western Anatolia. However, further studies are needed in sexing the individual infants be infant burials to address any additional distinction in sex, apart from the age and belief in the late personhood that we have been discussing in our contribution. In conclusion, I would like to thank the Austrian Science Fund and the European Research Council for funding the investigation at Çukuriçi Höyük and all the participants who took part in it. All publication from Çukuriçi ERC project can be accessed on the ERC project repository, Prehistoric Phenomenon. Last but not least, we would like to organize all of the organizer of TAG 2021, who has given us the opportunity to present a piece of our research, and to everyone who has attended our talk. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Sabina.